Sherlock Holmes. You've heard of him because everybody has. He is the most famous detective of all time. And if you haven't heard of him, well, that's a mystery all on its own. Even if you've never read a single one of his books, seen his movies, seen his plays, played his games, you probably do still know his hat, his pipe, maybe a magnifying glass. You might even know about his violin. Because that's what Sherlock Holmes is at this point, the symbol of mystery detectives. But why? Why is Sherlock Holmes so popular over any other detective? Well, gather around the fire, and I will tell you a tale. Sherlock Holmes was created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And before we talk about Sherlock Holmes himself, let's take a moment to talk about Sir Doyle first. Doyle was born into poverty initially and eventually went from being sent away from home to finding himself in a lunatic asylum. The only reason he eventually managed to study in both Scotland and England was the existence of his rich uncles. Somehow this is something popular writers had in common back then, rich family members. He studied medicine for a while, among other things, and during his time traveling to various places, he found himself working as a clerk for a Scottish surgeon and lecturer at the medical school of the University of Edinburgh. The surgeon's name was Joseph Bell, an observant man who even got involved in police investigations from time to time, including the Ripper murders with which he assisted Scotland Yard. You might already see the similarities, but yes, Joseph Bell was the man who influenced Conan Doyle the most while writing the character of Sherlock Holmes. Regardless, Doyle eventually opened a small office of his own where he took consultations as an ophthalmologist. This endeavor failed miserably as he had exactly 0 patients, and as medicine clearly wasn't his true passion, he went back to the writing table instead of the drawing board. Doyle had written several short stories before Sherlock, like The Mystery of Sasassa Valley and The American Tale, during his time at medical school. None of them made him quite as famous as Sherlock Holmes, however, which he started writing at only 27 years old. He wrote A Study in Scarlet in a mere 3 weeks. He found it difficult, however, to find a publisher for the work, and so he settled for Wardlock & Co., who paid him £25, which was still quite a bit in those times, in exchange for all the rights to the story and an eventual publication in 1887. His next piece, The Sign of the Four, appeared in Lippincott's magazine through Wardlock & Co. again, but at this point, Doyle felt like the publisher may well be exploiting him as a freshly started author, and so he left them to instead publish his short stories in Strand magazine, where they eventually got traction. The Strand magazine was an entity of its own when it launched in the UK in 1891. It also had a US branch, and in both of these branches, when the Sherlock stories started popping up, it exploded its popularity ever further. Not that the Strand actually needed Sherlock to become popular in the first place, because on their first run in January 1891, they already sold over 300,000 copies of their first issue. Doyle's first publication of Sherlock in the Strand was A Scandal in Bohemia, in the July edition of 1891, and it ballooned the already excellently performing magazine to ever higher numbers. People subscribed to the monthly purely for new Holmes stories, but eventually Doyle got bored of the character. Yes, really. He even wrote about his intentions to kill off the character to his mother, who responded with, "You won't! You can't! You mustn't!" And so, instead, Doyle attempted to raise the price of his stories to a level intended to discourage publishers from asking him for more Sherlock. However, to his dismay, publishers were more than willing to pay the outrageous prices he'd set for them. Sherlock was simply selling too well. This accidentally made Arthur Conan Doyle one of the best-paid authors of his time. But Doyle still wanted to write about things other than Sherlock, which led him to the final problem. In this intended final episode of the Sherlock Holmes saga, Doyle first introduced Professor James Moriarty, now better known as Sherlock's arch-nemesis. Moriarty was written as the most intelligent, the most devious villain of all, the man who had secretly orchestrated practically every previous Holmes adventure because he ruled over every criminal in the underworld. The perfect final villain for Holmes, the only one worthy of besting this most intelligent of detectives. At the Reichenbach Falls in Switzerland, both Sherlock and Moriarty fell to their deaths. And that was the end of Sherlock Holmes.
Well, I'm bored.
Oh, darling, your very rich uncles are sending you off to study medicine.
I suppose so.
Well, I'm bored. I think I'll start my own business. Well, this sucks. I think I'll go back to writing. Well, my writing's become incredibly popular, but I'm bored of my very popular character that is making me all this money. I'm going to kill him off. Sorry, weren't you born into poverty? I had rich uncles. It shows. Arthur Conan Doyle, however, had not realized exactly how popular Sherlock Holmes really was. In fact, Sherlock Holmes was so popular that it kicked off fandoms as we know them today for the first time. They were not happy that he killed Sherlock Holmes. Not even close. They took this extremely seriously. The Sherlockians, as they call themselves, or the Holmesians, started writing letters en masse, asking him what the heck he thought he was doing. Some of them even opened with, "You brute! How dare Arthur Conan Doyle take away this most beloved of characters from us, the people? How dare he?" After Sherlock's death in 1893, 20,000 readers immediately cancelled their subscriptions to Strand magazine, and eventually the magazine almost went under as a result of this historical event. Alongside the letters came the protests demanding Sherlock return, but Doyle wasn't bothered by all this pressure at all. When he killed Sherlock in the books, he made Watson write, "It is with a heavy heart that I take up my pen to write these the last words in which I shall ever record the singular gifts by which my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes was distinguished." But Doyle himself only noted in his diary, "Killed Holmes." He finally had time to dedicate to his historical novels. That was until he ran into some financial trouble. This ultimately changed his mind on the whole killing off the most lucrative and popular fictional character I have ever written deal. So he wrote The Hound of the Baskervilles, a story set before Sherlock's death. But in 1903, he went all in with The Adventure of the Empty House, where Sherlock explains that he faked his death in order to remain hidden from his enemies. Only Moriarty had died. In all, Doyle would write 4 novels and 56 short stories on Sherlock Holmes, the last of which was The Case Book of Sherlock Holmes, a batch of short stories. Doyle was certainly a very creative type of guy, not just for Sherlock Holmes, of course, but also other books like The Lost World, which is one of his more popular ones outside of the Holmes fandom, as we say. And he took a lot of his inspiration from the real world. Of course, Joseph Bell, that I already mentioned, but also, in general, other writers, something we'll get to later. However, I think most of all, Doyle might have enjoyed the idea of a character like Sherlock truly existing as he wrote them. It became very apparent, especially in his later life, that Doyle really wanted to believe in the supernatural as well. In fact, had he still been writing Sherlock at the time, I feel he might have added it into his stories altogether. In later life, Doyle became a renowned spiritualist. Yes, he was one of those people who believe in spirit photography and seances, something his friend Houdini disagreed with heavily. Yes, that Houdini, the illusionist. Doyle was convinced that Houdini's feats were actually achieved through the man's paranormal abilities, even when Houdini himself assured him that it was all illusion and trickery. When the illusionist became an avid anti-spiritualist after his mother's death, the two men went all out trying to convince each other of their right. At one point, Doyle's wife, Jean, who was now a self-proclaimed medium, invited Houdini to a séance where she would try to contact Houdini's late mother. She would use something called automatic writing to communicate. Automatic writing was a psychic ability that allowed a person to basically write for the ghost, or at least pretend to, because it's obviously rubbish. Houdini also figured that out when they pretended to actually make contact with his mother, which resulted in a 15-page letter written in perfect English. The Doyles thought Houdini looked very touched, but the man himself noted that he highly doubted that they actually contacted his mother because her English was terrible. This caused a permanent rift between the two friends, turning them into rivals of a sort instead. Doyle was so invested in his spiritualism that he'd consistently threaten people who worked on exposing the fraudulent nature of spiritualism. The psychical researcher Harry Price accused the spirit photographer William Hope of being a fraud at one point, and even though Doyle defended Hope, he was eventually exposed regardless through the use of other research. That didn't stop Doyle from threatening to have Price evicted from the National Laboratory of Psychical Research, and noting that if he continued his writings, he would meet the same fate as Harry Houdini, whatever that meant. Doyle and his friends abused poor Price for years afterwards. Of course, most people, especially scientists, eventually realized that spiritualism was always going to be a hoax, and so Doyle and 84 other members of the Society for Psychical Research resigned in protest, stating that the society was opposed to spiritualism. That didn't stop every single spiritualist Doyle later praised from being exposed as frauds one way or another. And he still insisted that Houdini was a powerful spiritualist medium who had performed his stunts by means of paranormal abilities and was using these abilities to block those of other mediums he was attempting to debunk. There were more instances like this, of course, but you get the point. Doyle was really into spiritualism.
So, show me how to do magic. Oh, it's not magic, it's illusions. Tricks? Yeah. Tricks. No, really, it's not magic at all. Alright, how do you do the tricks then? Well, I can't tell you, it's a secret. Aha! Magic. That's not proof that la 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 magic la 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 la.
That doesn't mean that Doyle was an idiot, obviously. Like I said, I really do think he just really truly wanted to believe in these sorts of things, in the something more of the world. Because on his own, he was a very keen and intelligent observer, noticing things that many others wouldn't. In fact, because of his inquisitive nature, he often poked his nose into places they perhaps shouldn't be, but only for the good of others. He managed to solve not one, but 2 cold cases where people were wrongly convicted by looking into it. He was just interested. He managed to clear the names of the 2 people wrongfully convicted, of course, but it also helped, among other cases, to establish the Court of Criminal Appeal. So, a special type of man, this Doyle, certainly. But what about his detective character? I don't think I need to explain in detail who Sherlock Holmes is, but in short, Sherlock Holmes is a consulting detective, known for his keen observational skills, deduction, forensic science, and logical reasoning, which he often puts to work during his cases. He aids Scotland Yard at times and uses them for information at others. He lives on 221B Baker Street, sometimes with his friend and confidant Dr. Watson, who also narrates all the books we read of Sherlock. Together, they go on adventures in the criminal underworld. Sherlock also has an older brother called Mycroft who is, by Holmes's own admittance, smarter than him, but not interested in being a detective. Holmes himself was a rather untidy man, though keen on personal cleanliness outside of his drug use. He was cold and calculating at most times, save once when Watson was wounded on the job. His final occupation was not detective, but beekeeper. And to give you an idea of how popular Sherlock truly was, outside of the fan clubs, by the 1990s there were already over 25,000 stage adaptations, films, television productions, and publications featuring Sherlock, and the Guinness World Records lists him as the most portrayed literary human character in film and television history. The man and his writer were as well known as Queen Victoria herself in his time. But why? Sherlock was not the first detective-type character of his kind. Émile Gaboriau's Monsieur Lecoq predates him, and likely even inspired him, as Holmes sometimes talks and behaves exactly like Lecoq. Sherlock even mentions Lecoq by name in A Study in Scarlet, where he calls Lecoq a miserable bungler. Lecoq, of course, was also the methodical, scientifically minded detective type, but better known perhaps is C. Auguste Dupin, a detective written by none other than Edgar Allan Poe himself. Sherlock also mentions him in the same book, where Watson compares Sherlock to Dupin, and Sherlock only notes that Watson must think this a compliment, but that Dupin is in fact inferior. Yes, let's just assume that Doyle was jesting and not being extremely petty, because both Dupin and Lecoq beat him to the punch in terms of character types. Because yes, Dupin was the detective who would attempt to put himself in the shoes of a criminal to figure out their motives. He was portrayed as a bit of a dehumanized thinking machine, interested mainly in logic, a brilliant eccentric who often had to deal with a bumbling policeman who was more foil than aid, like Lestrade in Sherlock. He also generally found information in places others might overlook. Likewise, Dupin introduced the companion character who is the narrator for the story, and the individual that gets things explained to them for the benefit of the audience. On top of that, he was the first of a kind to dramatically announce his solution, after which he explains the reasoning leading up to it. And here's the kicker. Before Poe wrote The Murders in the Rue Morgue, where Dupin first appeared, detectives as a genre didn't exist. You had mysteries, of course, but not the logical journey through a crime or case, or some such, where one follows the reasoning of an individual cracking the case with facts. Poe didn't even call his story a detective, but rather a tale of ratiocination, which basically comes down to tales of rational reasoning, except that doesn't sound as intelligent. With Dupin, Poe invented an entirely new genre. And Sherlock takes liberal inspiration from both him and Lecoq. Hilariously, Sherlock makes fun of Dupin at one point because Dupin has a knack for putting themselves in another person's place so well that it sometimes seems like he's reading their mind, which he also does to his companion once, and Sherlock calls this a shallow trick. Except in The Adventure of the Cardboard Box, he does the same thing to Watson, so I suppose he forgot he made that joke.
Your outfit sucks.
No, it doesn't.
Yes, it does.
Hey, what are you...
Especially your pipe.
You can't just...
Very bad glass, too.
Really, it seems like you like a lot of my things.
Whatever makes you say that?
Funnily enough, one of the things people do attribute to Holmes as a first is the arch-criminal mastermind, too clever to be caught by regular police trope, James Moriarty. It's ironic then that Doyle only wrote him in to stop the series from existing at all, and Moriarty only featured in one more story afterwards. It's the later adaptations that gave him a more prominent role, likely because he is still introduced as being the mastermind behind all other crimes. Yes, the eccentric detective type already existed by the time Sherlock Holmes was written, and yet Holmes became this well-loved, and not the others. Unfortunately for Sherlock fans, although Sherlock is fantastic and I love it very much, please don't kill me, I am one of you, it's not because Sherlock is the best written, most incredible, most mind-breaking story ever to be written in history. It was a combination of things. Yes, of course the stories had to be good to begin with. Sherlock Holmes is well written, gripping, and wildly entertaining, but as I said, Sherlock was not the first well-written detective. In fact, we also had another one in the novel The Moonstone, written by Wilkie Collins. However, Sherlock was still one of the first. From what I could find, Sherlock Holmes was the first detective to be written in serial form. Readers could follow along with him from story to story, building a bond with the character. Dupin was only written into 3 stories. The Moonstone was a singular novel, and Lecoq, while he did have several more stories, was French. And yes, that matters because Sherlock Holmes was an English detective who became well known through an English magazine with a US branch. This meant that Sherlock's reach was, especially for those times, spectacularly wide. And in the 19th century, one might say that the United Kingdom was the greatest superpower at the time, and America was doing pretty well on their own as well. But why Strand Magazine? Sherlock was published in a different magazine before this, and he didn't blow up there. Why were magazines even a big deal? Weren't there great books to read? Well, yes, except books weren't really available to anyone. In the 17th century, many commoners started to be able to read, but they couldn't really afford books. Then in the 18th century, public libraries, as we have them right now, didn't really exist. Most of them were privately owned and run for profit. In the 19th century, books became somewhat more available because of technological advances like printing presses and better transportation. However, they were still few and far between. Books were kind of a treat, not something you would just pick up on any day. But yes, that's still only some people. Books weren't exactly essentials back in the day, and when people did buy them, they would be very conscious of the price. For reference, even when books became somewhat affordable, they could still cost over 3 shillings, nearly £60 today. And while there were occasionally paperbacks available for 6pence, they were limited and books didn't come out every day. So, most families would subscribe to a monthly magazine, like The Strand. The Strand was much cheaper than most other monthly magazines available. In fact, its slogan was, "A monthly magazine costing 6pence but worth a shilling." The only other monthly magazine as cheap in the fiction category was Longman's Magazine, and they seemed to focus more on fiction commentary and somewhat less on stories. Not to mention that Newnes, the creator of The Strand, meant for each page in each issue to include at least one illustration, something no other publication at this time had achieved. It wasn't practical in the long run, of course, but the first issue still held to its goal, so it's full of pictures. But the Strand also specifically focused on a British middle-class audience. The cover image of the Strand magazine was Exeter Exchange in London. It was affordable to them, and roughly 5 months after their incredibly successful launch, they started running stories about a London detective called Sherlock Holmes. So, the combination of a highly praised and swiftly growing magazine, spread throughout 2 superpower countries at an extremely affordable price, while also being a well-written story in a brand new, unexplored genre in a serialized manner, created a perfect storm for success. And so, yes, Sherlock blew up beyond belief. Everyone knew his name. Everyone knew Arthur Conan Doyle, who was knighted in 1902 to become Sir Arthur Conan Doyle for reasons entirely unrelated to Sherlock, by the way. And we would never forget this particular detective ever again. But that still doesn't explain why Sherlock is still so popular today, right now, when many other detectives have been written by people like Agatha Christie, and also TV shows have started making strides in the detective genre all on their own. They didn't need Sherlock Holmes for that. But somehow, whenever any show or book or anything else really needs to grab a detective persona of any kind, really, someone remotely popular, it's always going to be Sherlock Holmes. Why? Of course, Sherlock was a very well-known name already, but he was also easier to use than any other popular detective at the time. And that's for the same reason most other extremely recognizable characters are reused over and over again. Characters like Dracula, Robin Hood, Lovecraft's stories, or even the entire cast of The Wizard of Oz and Alice in Wonderland. They're all in the public domain. The copyright for Doyle's works expired in the UK and Canada at the end of 1980, was revived in 1996, and then ended again in 2000. There were some problems for a select few stories in the US, but that didn't last long either, and the very final story will come out of copyright hell in 2023. So yes, anyone in the world can write a story about Sherlock. They can put him in modern days, give him alternate storylines, turn a dog into Sherlock Holmes. The possibilities are endless. You couldn't do that with a character like Poirot, who is still under copyright in the UK until 2046. Only 2 of his stories are in the public domain in the US so far. Sherlock really had everything going for him in order for the world to never forget his name. When looking at his image at a glance, most people can immediately tell who he is, regardless of detective skills. And that won't change for many years to come.
Yes, a curious case, this one. Wolguy was found in their apartment. Butchered, yes, butchered. Put up a fight, it seems, but the killer was nowhere to be found. So, of course, I called up my trusty assistant, Robertson, and we went off cavorting together to figure out who had committed this heinous murder. Our local informant, Lochmowin, pointed us to a nearby pub where we found a man called Adrian Peckle. A man with 1 leg and 1 arm and 5 eyes. Don't ask questions. He informed us that a strange couple, Septic and Kulsta is what they're known as, were seen that very night crawling out the window. And the barman Mike Zweers could attest to that. Indeed, he had seen them in their very bar. But why? They drank nothing. But all was not truly lost yet. No, a man called Ray Ray had found us the evidence we truly needed. A cat. Yes, dear listeners, a cat. The cat was Septic's. Kulsta had told him not to bring it with him, and yet, there it was. Clearly Septic's cat. The cat had left soot paws all over the corpse of Wolguy, and thus I didn't even really need to investigate further. It was elementary.